Good evening. I am Karen Taylor, Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, and I'm delighted to welcome you here to tonight's lecture, which is part of the 2021 Artisan Lecture Series. We very much appreciate your support and are so pleased that you can join us this evening. Some of you have actually been able to join us a little earlier than usual, and we're very glad that you could be with us. For those of you who are less familiar with the General Society, a brief introduction. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York is a non-profit organization that was founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen of New York City, by 22 artisans. And this lecture tonight is part of that legacy of honoring that tradition. Today, our 236-year-old organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life of the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs that include our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, our 200-year-old General Society Library, the John M. Mossman Lock Collection, and indeed this lecture series, of which was founded in 1838, and it won't be long before it is 200 years old. Before introducing our speaker, I just want to mention that after the presentation, we will have a short Q&A of 10 or 15 minutes. So please submit any type questions that you have through the Q&A, and of course you could do that at any part of the program, in addition to the conclusion of the actual program. And we'll try to get to as many as possible. We also, and we do ask that you use the Q&A option as opposed to raising your hand. So thank you for that. Now, this evening, we are so delighted to have here Samuel White to talk about Memory and Imagination, Stanford White in Detail, which is based on Mr. White's wonderful new book, Stanford White in Detail, which is available through the Moncelli Press. Architect and author Samuel G. White is a great-grandson of Stanford White, of course, who is one of New York's iconic architects, and has been studying the work of Stanford White and the architecture of the American Renaissance for more than 30 years. In this talk, based on his acclaimed book, Stanford White in Detail, he will produce an insightful overview of White's work and survey the materials and sources that he combined to create a panoply of sumptuous effects. Samuel G. White is a consulting partner of PBDW Architects in New York, and as a practicing architect with an extensive portfolio of preservation and adaptive reuse projects, as well as a deep interest in American residential architecture. He brings a unique perspective to the discussion of Stanford White's designs. It's now my huge pleasure to introduce to you Sam White. A warm welcome, Sam. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Karen, for that introduction. I just want to verify, can you see me now?
Yes, I have just stopped my share and I'm about to stop my video and to mute myself.
Okay, we'll give the audience a little taste of the backstage here. So anyway, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Karen, thank you very much for that introduction. And it is really a pleasure to be involved in your lecture series. I really admire the work that you do. The book that Karen mentioned, Stanford White in Detail, was here. This is keeps a very close, a tight focus on the ornamental details that animate and enrich Stanford White's work. And they are just delicious. I mean, this book is like a box of chocolates without any calories. I really recommend it in that respect. But this evening, I'd like to turn the telescope around and take a slightly broader look at the themes that connect Stanford White's work across the span of his career. Those themes include his collaborations with other artists and architects, the unique manner in which he used ornament, which the book does get into, and particularly the source of the inspiration for his remarkable designs. And I think that that source really arose from two factors, his memory and his imagination. Now, we all have memory and imagination to some extent, but in Stanford White's case, the combination was really like rocket fuel. He was able to take historic precedents and reinterpret them in ways that were both authentically original and at the same time reassuringly familiar. And I think that the skill with which he accomplished that made him one of the most important designers in the history of American architecture. Well, the facts of Stanford White's life are pretty straightforward. Let's see if we can get this enlarged here. He was born in New York in 1853. He died in New York in 1906 at the age of 53. So basically, by the time Stanford White was my age, he had been dead for 21 years. It was a remarkably compressed and productive career. When he was 19, he was apprenticed to Henry Hobson Richardson, who was the most important living American architect at the time. He worked for Richardson for 6 years, rising to become Richardson's principal assistant, and then leaving for a 15-month sabbatical to Europe, traveling around mostly Northern Europe, and returning in September 1879 to join Charles McKim and William Rutherford Mead. Well, their combination of compatible personalities and distinct but complementary artistic temperaments was an instant success. And over the next 25 years, McKim, Mead, and White grew from a small atelier of 9 architects to become the largest and most famous architecture firm in the country, if not in the world. Well, the process of acquiring imagination is something that Stanford White had at birth, but the process of acquiring memory really is something that he started working on when he started at Richardson's office. In the mid-1870s, he took a trip with his friends Charles McKim and William Mead. They weren't yet partners, but they did know each other, up to New England. They would later call this their celebrated New England walking tour. And they went to Salem, Massachusetts, and Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to look at examples of late colonial and early federal period architecture, such as the Gardner Pingree House here by Samuel McIntyre in Salem, Massachusetts. And Stanford White admired the proportions, the restrained use of color and ornament, the real discipline of this elevation. But I think what he was really smitten by was the front porch, that the porches and front doors on these federal period houses are just like sort of public sculpture on the street. He sketched this, he measured it, and 25 years later, he was able to use it in a house that he was doing in Southampton for his friend James Breeze. This house is now called the Whitefields Condominium. For those of you who know the Hamptons, it was then called Orchard. But it was an interesting house because it was a Palladian scheme with a series of pavilions that were linked by hyphens. And as you passed from one pavilion to another, in this case, as you went from the main block of the house into the music room, you went through the hyphen, which was treated like an outdoor space to the point where it even had its own front door. He used the rest of what he had seen in this New England walking tour in what was one of the first federal revival houses in New York City, a house he did for Charles Dana Gibson on 73rd Street, just off Lexington Avenue. So you can see that he took this in and he remembered it and used it well. Here's a sketch he made on that walking tour in his sabbatical in Europe. This is the Chateau de Plessis, Marseille. It's near Anjou in sort of northwestern France. And White was clearly taken in this case by the kind of the picturesque medieval character of this composition. It's slightly in decay, but it has this wonderfully sort of asymmetrical, opportunistic roof line. It's got that great arch over the corner door, and then the wonderful texture on the underside of the projecting bay on the left. And he didn't have to wait 25 years to use this. Less than a year after he made this sketch, he was back in New York working on the Newport Casino. And I think that you would agree that what he saw in Anjou informed what he did on the interior courtyard of the Newport Casino, with the same sort of opportunistic roof line, the same great arch over the doorway, the wonderful texture in this case, on the spandrel over that passage. So a short shelf life for that particular idea. Well, the trip to Europe, the sabbatical, began with a 1-month trip down the Rhone to look at examples of Romanesque architecture. He took this trip with his friends Charles McKim and Augustus St. Gaudens. And at the end of the trip, St. Gaudens made this medal to commemorate the trip made by these 3 close friends. They were all redheads, incidentally. And here you can see the faces. There's Charles McKim with his tall forehead. There's St. Gaudens with his pointed beard. And there's Stanford White looking like he's just stepped on a 3rd rail, which is pretty much how he looked most of the time. And the rest of the medal is filled with little sort of cartoons of some of the undergraduate hijinks that I think punctuated this trip, but also some of the things they saw. In the upper right, you see that little almost cartoon of the facade of a church. And that is the Cathedral of Saint-Gilles-du-Gard in a town just north of Avignon. And after White saw this, he wrote to his mother saying that this was the finest piece of architecture in all of France. Well, it's a terrific piece of architecture, but Stanford White was given to these kind of uncritical superlatives. And again, he stored this away, and 25 years later, he had an opportunity to use it when he got a commission from Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt to do a set of memorial doors for her husband that would go on to St. Bartholomew's Church. But it's not the St. Bartholomew's that you're thinking of. This St. Bartholomew's was by James Renwick. It was at the corner of 47th Street and Madison Avenue. You can see Stanford White's adaptation of the Saint-Gilles-du-Gard doors there. And 25 years after White did this, the congregation moved up to Park Avenue and 51st Street. And they were so enamored of their portals that they insisted that Bertram Goodhue incorporate them into his design for the new St. Bartholomew's Church. And you have to wonder at what point in the design process did they inform Goodhue that this was their intent. And you have to also agree that Goodhue may have received that information with slightly mixed feelings, because it's a difficult form to integrate with Goodhue's paradigm of a church. But nonetheless, we are the beneficiaries of this. It's a terrific piece of street furniture, and it picks up Park Avenue tremendously. The trip to Paris, to France, included, as I say, St. Gaudens. St. Gaudens was in France at the time working on this statue. This is the David Glasgow Farragut statue in Madison Square. This was St. Gaudens' first public commission. It was the commission that really allowed him to break into the first rank of American sculptors. It's a commission that really changed the course of American public sculpture, because here you have a couple of things. You have a military hero who's wearing contemporary naval uniform rather than a Roman toga, which is how it had been handled up till then. But also St. Gaudens is capturing a kind of a psychological moment, sort of a nanosecond in which Farragut sees something on the horizon and he's just tensing his left arm to reach for his binoculars. This was a collaboration. St. Gaudens invited Stanford White to design the base for his statue, and Stanford White was not going to miss an opportunity to see if he could change the course of the design of the bases in American sculpture as well. Although I think that subsequent architects have never had quite as much nerve as White had in this, and I think subsequent sculptors have never been willing to let their collaborator upstage them to quite this extent. But it's a marvelous base. It's got allegorical figures. It's got wonderful text on it, and it's curved into the shape of an exedra or an outdoor bench, which is almost inviting the observer to come in and sit really at the feet of the naval war hero. And in this respect, it is an early sign of what you will see in Stanford White's architecture, which was that he insisted on making his designs engage the observer almost in a dialogue. I call it the architecture of empathy. This is not a static composition. This is a composition that really is pulling you in and asking you to participate in it. If you want to see the difference between Stanford White and Charles McKim in a nutshell, compare the Farragut with the Sherman statue up on 59th Street and Fifth Avenue. Again, the work of sculpture is by Augustus St. Gaudens, but the base in this case is by Charles McKim. And Charles McKim is really keeping his eyes on the road. He sees his job simply to handle the transition from the vertical nature of the sculpture to the horizontal ground plane. And he accomplishes this with a series of just perfectly proportioned classical profiles. It's really a beautiful thing, but very different. There's no engagement of the observer. This is almost a static presentation of a really terrific piece of sculpture. That piece of sculpture needed no help from the base at all. White participated, and again, we are the beneficiaries. Both White and St. Gaudens signed their work on the back of this crab, which is set into the pebble dash at the base of the statue. And here you get a first taste of Stanford White's preference for these sort of picturesque but slightly bizarre looking creatures. And he would use those in various times in his career. Example, here is an abstracted spider's web, which is on the balcony of the library in the 7th Regiment Armory on 65th Street. And this is a room that Stanford White pretty much designed on his own. I mean, all the elements, the ceiling with the plaster basket weave, the fireplace, the details of the woodwork are elements that White would be using really throughout the rest of his early period. But the overall composition was a collaboration with a group called the Associated Artists, a group led by Louis Comfort Tiffany, who's in the lower left. It had Lockwood DeForest, who looks like he's dressed for a costume party in the upper left, Samuel Coleman, a painter in the upper right, and then Candace Wheeler in the lower right. She designed the fabrics that went into this space. And they were professional interior decorators. They had done a room in the White House. They did the Havemeyer House in New York. They did the interiors of the Mark Twain House in Hartford, which is still extant. You can see an example of their work there. And for one project, they enlisted Stanford White as a collaborator, and that was for the Veterans Room at the 7th Regiment Armory, which is one of the most, if not the most important aesthetic period room in America. It's a room that really redefines the concept of visual overload. And it's a room in which I think it is impossible to tell with any certainty who was responsible for what. You had these 5 very, very talented young architects and designers working together, and they, I think they kind of influenced each other. My firm had the privilege of helping to restore this room a couple of years ago, but I'm still overwhelmed by it every time I go in. When White was in Richardson's office, the mantra was that the architect was the leader of a group of craftsmen and artists. This was the Beaux-Arts approach, and as practiced by Richardson. And here is an example of White as the leader of this kind of team. It had this is the Church of the Ascension on 5th Avenue and 10th Street, and the mural is done by John Lafarge, who's in the lower right. That's the mural of the Rising Christ. Louis St. Gaudens is in the upper right. He was the brother of Augustus. He did the bas-relief of those angels that are hovering over the altar. And then the mosaics on the back wall were done by David Maitland Armstrong, who's in the lower left. This is an interesting project, just in terms of how it came to be. The church itself had been designed by a couple of, I'd say 40 years earlier, for a low church congregation who insisted that the church not have a chancel, because the chancels were these sort of the scene of all kind of popish doings. And so the church, the architect backs the end of the nave right up against the parish house so that you can't expand it any further. Well, so 40 years later, Stanford White is working for a congregation that has moved liturgically to the left or the right, depending on your point of view, and they want a chancel. And so Stanford White has to create a chancel where Upjohn, the architect, had made pretty sure none could ever be made. And White came up with a solution that's really a decorative solution rather than architectural, when he takes over the last bay and he just sort of smothers it with wonderful finishes, wonderful materials, and gives this a chancel. He signs it in effect with this overscaled peacock, which again shows his taste for these slightly bizarre animals. Well, his greatest collaborations were obviously those with Charles McKim, who's on the right, and William Rutherford Mead, who's standing. And when they started working, they took over Richardson's old office down at 57 Broadway. And the work of the early portion of this firm, the early years of the firm, shows the unintended consequences of what happens when you put two very strong designers in one relatively small space. That there gets to be a kind of a struggle for participation and even for control over the design of some of these projects. And an example of this is the Samuel Tilton House in Newport on Sunnyside Place, from the early 80s. Well, here is the south elevation, and you see this great broad gable that's organizing the whole composition, the strongly asymmetrical two-story bay, the organization of windows into these continuous horizontal bands. This is 100% Charles McKim. This is Charles McKim's sort of paradigm for the McKim, Mead, and White shingle style. But as you move around the house to look at the other elevations, you see Stanford White clawing his way back into the game. Here's the west elevation where you don't have any of those continuous horizontals. You have a real mix of different materials and effects. The panel in the upper right is called a sgraffito panel, made by putting bits of broken glass and seashells and rocks into wet cement to make that image. You have half timbering with pebble dash infill on the left, that window below it with those tiny little panes of glass separated by lead with this wonderful texture. These are things that Stanford White had seen on his trip to Northern Europe. And here he was using them to create a new American architecture. As you go around to the north elevation, I think Stanford White is now completely in control with, again, the half timbering, the pebble dash infill, the small panes of glass with leaded dividers, and then this really amazing sgraffito panel that has bits of broken beer bottles stuck into the wet cement. I mean, he must have climbed up onto the scaffold to do it himself, because you could never communicate something like this with a drawing or even verbally. So this is an autograph Stanford White. The interior was not so much a competition for participation as a clear allocation of roles. McKim did the plan. The plan is called the living hall plan, in which you have a space that is the operationally and even sort of psychologically the center of the house. It has the stair, it has a fireplace, it's near the front door, it's got these benches, and all the other rooms sort of spin off this like blades off a pinwheel. This is something that McKim had started to develop when he worked in Richardson's office just before Stanford White got there. But McKim and Mead had brought White into the partnership because they recognized that they did not have a flair for interiors. And I think you will admit that in the case of the Tilton House, they certainly had picked the right man. Well, White could collaborate vertically within the office as well as horizontally with his partners. This is a picture of an architect called Joseph Morrow Wells, and it's one of the few pictures you're going to see of him because he was camera shy. Wells was a really interesting guy. He was exactly Stanford White's contemporary, born in 1853. Like Stanford White, he finished high school, but had never had any academic training in architecture. He learned through apprenticeships and self-taught and pure talent. He had talent in abundance. He was the first employee hired by McKim, Mead, and White, and he rose to become the principal designer in the drafting room, working very, very closely with Stanford White on projects to the point where it's almost impossible to tell who did what. But it's pretty clear that Joseph Morrow Wells had a major role in the design of the exterior elevations of the Villard houses. Here, Stanford White had come up with a plan that took 6 townhouses and organized them to appear to be a single grand palazzo. Then White left for New Mexico to go see his brother Richard, leaving Joseph Morrow Wells to develop the elevations. And up to this point, the McKim, Mead, and White elevations for their urban work had been as kind of a Richardsonian Romanesque idiom. And I think that Wells decided that it was time for them to grow up. And so he developed his elevations according to the Italian Renaissance, sort of picking in particular elements from the Palazzo della Cancelleria in Rome. And White comes back from New Mexico. They see this and they agree that this is in fact a fine thing indeed. And I think that you'd have to say Wells was responsible for a major role in helping the firm sort of redirect from their Richardsonian idiom of the early work to the Renaissance work of their maturity. And well, White certainly participated in the interiors. Here is a collaboration between Stanford White and Augusta St. Gaudens. This is called the Zodiac Clock, full of all kinds of exotic, bizarre creatures, but it's a real work of art and a work of extraordinary craftsmanship as well. But for the rest of the interiors, I'd say White and Wells collaborated to see how much of Henry Villard's money they could spend. I mean, here is the front hall with the walls covered with sienna marble, which is very expensive. Those windows are by Maitland Armstrong again. But look at the column capital with its upturned volutes, and it's the volute as the medallion as a wagon wheel, which represented the fact that Villard's money came from railroads. And then look at those balusters below it, which are really like embroidery or tapestries that are sort of recreated in sienna marble. It's a combination of extraordinary craftsmanship, extraordinary imagination, and apparently bottomless pockets. Well, here's a picture of the music room in the Villard houses. And that is possibly Joseph Morrow Wells sitting in the chair. That's a doorway, not a fireplace, just to get you to understand the scale of this image. It's a huge room. And Wells looks exhausted, which he had every right to be because he worked himself literally to death. Joe Wells died in 1890, and he is buried in Oak Grove Cemetery in Medford, Massachusetts. And about 2 years ago, I found the stone, which had been carved by St. Gaudens and designed by Stanford White in this condition. And I wrote to a number of people who I thought would be interested in the project, and we were able to restore the stone and re-erect it. We added a marble base to it to keep the lawnmower away. And so we worked with a landscape architect named Jay Olmsted. So this was truly a kind of a home team performance on both ends of its life. It's really worth a visit. It's a wonderful piece of sculpture. It's a terrific footnote in the history of the American Renaissance, and it's in the back of the Oak Grove Cemetery in the older portion if you go up to see it. Well, White's early work shows him starting to emerge from, I would say, the dominance of McKim to develop his own style as an architect, his own preferences. And I think an example of White's emergence as an independent designer can be seen in this house. This is called the Alden Villa. It's in Cornwall, Pennsylvania, which is near Lancaster. And it must have been a sort of a 5, 6, or 7 hour train ride from New York, because there could not have been direct rail connections to Cornwall, Pennsylvania in those days. You had to go across the Hudson River by ferry and then make at least one transfer, if not two. And so because White was the junior partner in the firm, I think he drew the short straw and was sent out to take a look at the site. And then having done that, he went back to the railroad station to take the 4, 5, 6, or 7 hour trip back into New York. And I am convinced that in the course of the trip back to New York, Stanford White designed this house because it is everything that he is interested in and not what McKim is interested in. I mean, starting with the massing is much more complex than the McKim paradigm. You have that porte cocheres are based on medieval French prototypes that White had seen on his sabbatical. You have that arch over the window to the staircase. You have the lattice that he had seen on his New England walking tour. And then the whole house is covered with clapboard and shingles that are painted instead of being natural wood. So here we're heading towards a different design altogether. Stanford White signed this house everywhere he could by adding these wonderful sgraffito panels and pebbles and broken glass. He put them on the soffits of the projecting roof. He makes them out of wood and gesso. Clearly he is saying, I did it. Well, my favorite element on the outside of this house is this 2-story bay that rises to become a porch and a roof. And the roof is like a candle snuffer with this sort of unexpectedly decorative flashing detail where the two slopes intersect, topped with this starburst of twisted wire. And then the best part of all are those columns, which are just these muscular columns that are kind of flexing to support the roof. I mean, I told you that White's architecture was an architecture of empathy, and here he is drawing you into this composition. This is not something that you can look at and not feel the strength of those columns. Well, the inside shows a little bit of memory and a lot of imagination. The Ceiling of the entrance hall is based on a plate from a book called The Elements of Arab Art, published in Paris in 1850. Those lanterns look like they're taken out of a opium den. And then that wonderful screen at the bottom of the stairs is called a mashrabia screen. It was a North African element that was developed to provide ventilation and privacy. But what White liked about them was the way light passed through them, that at first it would break up the light, and as the light got stronger, it would sort of dissolve the pattern. And this is something that he would do with his textures, reveal them and then dissolve them in light. The other thing about this room is that the incredible array of wood details. I mean, it's almost as if Stanford White felt that he was never going to get another commission to do an entry hall again, because sort of every single idea he could think of is squeezed in there. And here you're starting to see how White used compression and release as a kind of the engine to animate his architecture. This is an example of compression, and compression at two levels. One is it's not very big. This is a substantial country house, but this is a relatively small entrance, but he's squeezed every idea he could think of into this. So you are compressed visually as well as spatially. But as you go through that wide opening, this is the room you come into, the Great Hall. It's 2.5 or 3 stories tall. This is the release. I mean, the room is bathed in this wonderful even light that comes from 14 stained glass windows at the south end. The half timbering is flush with the plaster rather than being set off by pebble dash. The plaster itself just has these sort of gold stars stenciled onto it. That mantle, the chimney, is really a domesticated version of something he must have seen on his trip to northern France. So this is quite subdued. This is the release after the compression. In the other rooms, imagination takes over. This is the dining room. The ceiling of the dining room is fishnet that has been glued to the plaster ceiling. The upper walls are woven cane. The lower walls are marquetry blocks, the end grain of wood. And then you have that extraordinary sideboard where the upper 2/3 of it are clearly built into the architecture of the room. But the bottom third of it looks as if it's trying to be a freestanding piece of furniture. And here, I call this the estuarial middle ground between architecture and furniture. I mean, Stanford White just loved the ambiguity of something that was both subject to both interpretations almost simultaneously and competing with each other. And it just sort of vibrates in terms of which one is it. There's a painted room in the house where White starts to explore what would be his favorite color scheme of gold on top of ivory colored paint. He's exploring his own personal vocabulary of moldings rather than the sort of the classical Vitruvian moldings that McKim loved so much. Here, White is looking at these sort of bundled readings. And then that octagonal frame that would have been around a mirror that is no longer there is very much like the designs he did for his frames. Stanford White was the great American frame designer of the late 19th, early 20th century. And his frames are still available as reproductions. They're breathtakingly expensive. They're probably even more expensive if you can find an original, but here's an example of one. Here's an example of another in a more Renaissance idiom. And this one is enclosing a bas-relief by Augustus St. Gaudens of Bessie Springs Smith. This was a present to Stanford White from his friend St. Gaudens on the occasion of White's marriage to Bessie in February 1884. And so at this point, White becomes a married man. This piece is now in the Metropolitan. White celebrates the marriage with a present to his wife of this piece of jewelry that he designed where the two crabs are grasping this Baroque pearl. So White still has his taste for these slightly bizarre animals. But they go off on a honeymoon to the Mediterranean, traveling as far west as I'd say Spain, possibly, certainly as far east as Constantinople, which is where this wonderful photograph of the rising young architect was taken, but spending most of their time in Italy, going up and down the peninsula. I don't think they did go to Africa on this trip. And I think that it was on this trip, though, that Stanford White sort of came to the conclusion that his paradigm for changing the city of New York, which was really an ugly town in those days, into something worthy of its rising stature as a kind of a banking and merchant capital was the Italian Renaissance architecture. And so he takes a building like this. This is the Santa Maria in Cosmedin, the church in Rome, where you go with your 12-year-old to stick his or her hand in the lion's mouth to see if he's telling the truth or not. And it's a real tourist trap. You can see this line of people waiting to get in. But White takes the tower and he plops that tower on top of the Judson Memorial down on 4th Street, just south of the Washington Square Park. And this must have been really a shock to New Yorkers. I mean, they had never seen anything like this on the skyline before. And this is Stanford White's shot across the bow saying that there is kind of a new aesthetic in town, and this is where it is going to be coming from. Well, White looks at the front porch of something like Santa Maria in Cosmedin, which is a pretty plain affair, and he decides that for the Judson Memorial, he is going to come up with this incredible piece of Renaissance eye candy. I mean, here is just amazing thing with bracketed by those deeply vermiculated rustication made out of terracotta blocks. But here is what sort of establishes the sort of the celebration of the walk along 4th Street. It's really worth a separate trip. My favorite of these memory imagination combines, as it were, are these two buildings here. The building on the left is in Verona. It's called the Loggia del Consigli, the porch of the lawyers. While the building on the right is is the Torre Orologio in St. Mark's Square, the clock tower. And White takes these two buildings and he sort of inhales them. And what he exhales is this building. This was the headquarters for the New York Herald newspaper. It was an entire newspaper operation in a single building with editorial and writers' business offices on the 2nd floor and production, typesetting, and printing on the 1st floor. In the basement, you could actually step into that arcade on the left, look down through plate glass windows and see the newspaper being printed. It must have been just a wonderful thing. This was right at the intersection of 6th Avenue and Broadway, hence the trapezoidal shape. This is the building that I most regret of McKim, Mead, and White's is no longer there. It just must have been an absolute showstopper. And it's also the building that Charles McKim described as the finest piece of architecture produced by our firm. Well, whether or not White went to Spain on his honeymoon, he knew this building. This is called the Giralda, which means weather vane in Spanish. This is the tower of the cathedral in Seville, a structure that started off as an Islamic structure for a mosque, but after the expulsion of the Moors from Spain, it was Christianized. It was increased in height, given this Renaissance sort of icing on top, and then surmounted with a statue of the Archangel Michael, which would rotate in the wind, hence the name weather vane, Giralda. And White takes this and he translates this into his own more Renaissance idiom, helped by the fact that he's now dealing with a steel-framed structure rather than a load-bearing masonry structure. So he can attenuate it, make it much more slender, much thinner, and much more vertical in that sense. And then he tops it with a statue of Diana, which was the first nude statue in America in a public piece of architecture. And it's something that I think it probably appalled some, it amused many, and the Diana, I would say, is the kind of defining piece of sculpture of the late 19th century in America. Well, this whole tower complex topped Madison Square Garden, a building that redefined so much of New York. I mean, it redefined New Yorkers' expectations of what to demand from their public architecture. Here was a building that took up a huge amount of real estate, but look what it was giving back, both on the outside. I mean, it animated the street for blocks in every direction. And then on the inside with these sort of multiple venues and types of entertainment, it animated the skyline with the tower. Diana was lit up. You see those lights at the base, at the foot. And when it was lit up, you could see it from as far away as Greenwich, Connecticut. So it transformed New York in that respect. It also transformed Stanford White. I think he became the most visible architect in New York once this was opened in 1889, and commissions started coming in from all directions. Well, one of the directions was from this man. This is Henry McCracken, who was the chancellor of what was then called the City University of New York. It changed its name very soon after this to New York University, and that's how I will refer to it. But McCracken was the head of what was really, at best, a small regional liberal arts university. But his vision was to transform NYU into a major research university on the model of the great German universities. And to do that, he needed more space than what was available in Greenwich Village at the time. And so he bought 40 acres of land up in the Bronx. He hired Stanford White to come up with a master plan for the campus and to design the academic buildings. And beginning with the principal academic building, which was the Gould Memorial Library, which you see a plan here. This building was named after the family of Jay Gould, who were exceptionally generous to NYU in the early days. If you look on the left of this plan, you see those small spaces called offices. Well, that was McCracken's office. And this was the days when university administrations were a lot smaller than they are today. But the main event here is the reading room on the right. That circular reading room surrounded by a ring of columns, surrounded by open stacks between the columns, and then closed stacks in that layer behind it. And if you were going to do a circular reading room, you really had one place to look, which was the Pantheon in Rome, the building that is said to be the single most influential classical building of all time in terms of the number of architects who have looked at it and then used it as a starting point for their own designs. And what I find interesting is that each architect who looks at this sort of takes something slightly different away from it. That McKim, for example, was doing the library at Columbia University at exactly the same time that White was doing the library for NYU. McKim saw the Pantheon as a kind of a wall that closed off and defined an urban space. And so what McKim did was he dropped the pediment, he increased the height of the attic, added a couple of columns to either side, and created this gigantic backstop for the open space at Columbia University. This was his sort of reinterpretation of the Pantheon. I think that Stanford White looked at the Pantheon really through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson, who saw the Pantheon as a kind of a rural Palladian villa structure that sort of defined space by being an object within space and holding its own on the strength of its foreground elements rather than its planar qualities. And that's what White used at the Gould Memorial Library. You can see the overall view here. And also what you start to see is White's approach to ornament, that particularly look at the dome and the Chateau above the upper pediment, that White took ornament, which he sort of used to a level of density that approached saturation, and then he would relieve that with these relatively plain surfaces. So again, it's compression and release, and that is what keeps this thing alive. Here's a close-up detail showing the compression, that the texture in the roof is copper shingles that are stamped to look like fish scales, and then the density of the Chateau on the top of the pediment is, I would say, about achieves its limit. But then look at this variegated brick and the plain limestone below it. That's the movement that you see visually in this. There's a similar sense of movement inside as well. Here's the main entrance steps, and it looks pretty fancy from here, but it's actually a rather austere space. I mean, the walls are undecorated, and as you go up these stairs, you're aware that it's sort of taller, narrower, steeper, longer than you would really like. And you get to the top of the stair and you're a little bit out of breath, and you go through those doorways that are right on axis, and this is what you come into. I mean, there is not a single person who comes into this room for the first time or even for the 100th time who doesn't stop right having taken a step into that room and just take a deep breath and admire what Stanford White has done, among other things, as a kind of reward for climbing up those stairs. Well, White could take the Pantheon and sort of translate it into different idioms as well. Here, the Pantheon is represented as a Byzantine structure. This was for the Madison Square Presbyterian Church, said to be one of his finest designs. It had an unfortunately short life because of the real estate needs of the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company and the fact that all of the congregants of this church had moved uptown and just weren't coming down to Madison Square anymore. But look at the frieze there on the left. I mean, a density that is so great that I don't think a bird could find a place to hide into it. But then when you look at the overall, you realize that he's relieved it with these large areas of relatively lightly variegated brick. And that is how this building works. Well, he could speak other languages as well. Here is the building called the Grand Trianon at Versailles. This was the building that Louis XIV built as a place for him to entertain his mistresses. And White takes this building and he takes the general partie, the one-story building, the ABA, solid void, solid rhythm, the pairs of columns with ionic capitals and flanking arched windows. And he uses that up in Rhinebeck, New York, in a building called the Ferncliff Casino for John Jacob Astor IV. And here, Astor was not using this to entertain his mistresses at all. He was using this to basically house the bachelor male weekend guests for his house parties. If you remember in the house of Edith Wharton's House of Mirth, Lily Bart goes on one of these weekend house parties, and the point of them was to introduce eligible men to eligible women under highly controlled circumstances, of which the most highly controlled were the sleeping arrangements. And so the women were kept up in the main house, and then about 500 yards away, you had this garçonniere, sort of a bachelor's quarters for the male bachelor guests. But it had more than that. It had some program spaces as well that I think Louis would have been extremely envious of. Here is the main hall, which is big enough to take helicopter lessons in. But look at the way White is pulling in elements from different cultures and different periods to make his interior. The medallion in the center of that skylight is in fact Apollo. So that's a reference to the Sun King. But then he surrounds that with this plaster wreath that looks like it's taken as a frame from a Botticelli painting or a Luca della Robbia. And then compared to that, you have the mantelpiece, which is this sort of rather brutal, almost abstracted medieval element. Again, by comparison, you look at the capitals on the columns, which are called French Ionic with the outturned volutes and the little tassels hanging down. And then the transoms over the French doors look like they're sort of a lot closer to Salem, Massachusetts than to Versailles. So in a certain sense, nothing was safe from Stanford White. If it looked good, if it worked well together, it was irrelevant to him where it came from, what the period was, what the cultural associations were. He was purely interested in the visual composition that he was able to create. The house has a indoor tennis court, which was a collaboration with the Guastavinos. It's a wonderful piece of engineering. And it has an indoor swimming pool, which was the first or second indoor swimming pool in America. The only competition would be Biltmore down in North Carolina. But here White creates this space that is like a dream out of the Arabian Nights, just using three elements, essentially. It's a water, light, and white marble. I can tell you from direct personal experience that if you go swimming in the swimming pool, you feel as though you have died and gone to heaven, because I've been lucky enough to have been working on the restoration of this house for the last 15 years. That's a long story, but it has amazing spirit. I mean, look at those porpoises sort of emerging from the foliate leaves of the column capital. And I think that that is true for all of Stanford White's designs, that they had real spirit, but it wasn't just a spirit for sort of its own sake. It was spirit that was highly directed to reflect or represent his understanding of what the culture of the client was. And I think the best example of how he did that can be seen in the clubhouses that he designed in New York City. I mean, take the Century Association on 43rd Street, right across the street from you here. This is a club where the members were poets, painters, sculptors, etchers, writers, journalists, architects. I mean, and White creates a facade that suggests that what lies on the other side of those doors and windows is sort of akin to the artistic fervor of Florence in the 15th century. That is the spirit that he is expressing there. Or 20 blocks to the south, he did the Players Club by converting Edwin Booth's townhouse on Gramercy Park into a club for actors. And being an actor is an exceptionally precarious profession. And here, the front doors suggest that what lies on the other side of them is a world of serenity and security and safety. And for an actor, that must have been a very welcome sight indeed. White did the first purpose-built women's club in America. This is the Colony Club on 29th Street and Madison Avenue. And here, he's giving a very interesting, almost nuanced message that the kind of the macro view of this is that based on late colonial, early federal period precedents, that this, what lies on the other side of these doors and windows is a world of order and discipline. And yet when you get very close, you look at these sort of wonderful juxtapositions, this exceptionally ornate column capital is set against this almost sort of craftsman or aesthetic movement of crude brickwork with those little bits of coal that are stuck into the mortar joints. He's saying that there's actually something a little bit more interesting going on in this building than you might at first think. Well, here was an unmixed message. This is the Metropolitan Club done for the merchant elite of New York, led by J.P. Morgan. And White sort of celebrates their merchant eliteness by taking essentially a Renaissance palazzo. He decorates the outside of it with elements from the Palazzo Farnese. So he's off to a great start. And then he gives it this gate that is like something almost you would expect to see at the Elysee Palace in Paris. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. The way it worked was that members would go in through those gates in their carriage. The carriage would turn around, the member would get out of the carriage and go in the front door without ever having to step on the sidewalk or mingle with the likes of me. But sort of in exchange for this sort of ostentatiously public act of private circulation, what White is doing is he's giving us this incredible present. I mean, we are the ones who appreciate this gate because we're walking down the sidewalk. It is an example of really giving back to an extraordinary level. Well, members were not shortchanged at all. I mean, they would go in through the front door, into the that neoclassical vestibule, through that arch, and into the great marble hall. And then they would look up and they would see what Stanford White had produced for their edification. And I think they would feel as though their self-esteem had been appropriately recognized and properly satisfied. So it really depended on what the culture of the client was. Here, the culture was not a single client, but the whole New York City. This is the Washington Memorial Arch. This started off as a paper mache, plaster, and wood structure that was about 150 feet north of where it is now. It was an element in a parade that was celebrating the 150th anniversary of the birth of George Washington. And it was so popular that by public subscription, which included pennies from school children, the money was raised to build the thing in marble and set it in Washington Square. And it became the kind of the beginning or end element in every great parade up and down Fifth Avenue, which was the sort of the main parade route here. And here you see people going through in their open touring cars en route to celebrate something. Sadly, we can no longer go through this in our open touring cars if we had them, because they put these granite bollards up to prevent that kind of activity. But you can still have some fun visually by looking at the sculpture on the Washington Arch. I mean, you know that the figures of Washington at war and Washington at peace at the bottom were done by the father of Alexander. Alexander, come to me in a minute, but the upper Calder, the upper reliefs were done by an architect named Frederick McMonnies, an artist who was a friend of Stanford White's, and he was a frequent house guest at Box Hill, the White's country house in Long Island. And I think almost in gratitude for the sort of the gracious hospitality that had been shown to him by the Whites, he put Bessie Springs Smith White in the upper left-hand spandrel. There, you can go down and admire her anytime you want. Well, she looks like she's announcing something, maybe a great parade. Well, Stanford White was a sort of a professional party goer. I mean, he was going to these things for a real reason. There's a picture of him here at the James Hazen Hyde Ball in 1905. And I think he went to these parties for two reasons. One was to keep an eye on his existing and prospective clients. That's Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish sitting in the chair on the right in that sort of 18th century French ball gown. But I think he also went to keep an eye on the competition. That you see Francis Hoppin is sitting on the floor. And Francis Hoppin had been another protege of Stanford White's. He had worked for White at McKimby and White, and then went off on his own with to form a firm called Hoppin and Cohn. And I think that Stanford White was making sure that people like Francis Hoppin were not basically poaching his client base. And so you had to be alert. White would complain that he had to work all day and then get dressed up and do the party thing every night, but he certainly knew parties. And if you were designing a party, you would hire Stanford White to help you. And if you were designing a house or building a house for parties, you would definitely get Stanford White to help you, because I am convinced that if you were in a room at a party that was designed by Stanford White, you have more fun because the room is really doing half the work. And an example of that, and really the best example, is this house here, Rosecliff in Newport, a house that was built for Tessie Ulrichs, who was the heiress to the Comstock lode fortune, the largest amount of silver ever removed from the bowels of the earth. And so Tessie was the richest, or one of the richest women in America. And her goal was to build a house that would allow her to give the single best party in a 60-day social season at Newport. It was just July and August was when the action was in Newport, and there must have been 10 or 15 parties a night. Do the math, but she wanted to give the single best one, and that was Stanford White's brief. And this is what he came up with. If you were invited to this party, your pleasure was anticipatory to begin with. You would be going down Bellevue Avenue, which is a processional route, holding onto your invitation and looking forward to this. The carriage would turn and go down the driveway, and you would now start to look at the house. And you would start to think about a couple of things. I mean, one is that the house is based on the Grand Trianon with an extra story here. Then you might think about the fact that the front door is off to the right, as opposed to every other grand house in Newport where it's sort of dead center. And this is very important to the design. And then as your carriage pulls up, you might notice that Stanford White still had not lost his taste for the picturesque character of these slightly bizarre animals. But at any rate, you go through the front door, into the vestibule, up a few steps through that arch. And what White is now doing is he's taking this processional route, which had been sort of extended up till now, and he's starting to compress it into these sort of staccato series of moments. And you get to the bottom of the stair, and then if you were a couple, the men would wait at the bottom of the stair. They'd hand their coats off, and the women would go up the stairs to take their coats off, to take a last look in the mirror, make sure everything was in order, turn around, and then they would descend the finest staircase in America. And this is not an uncritical superlative. This is really the berries. This shows sort of Stanford White's ability to take a processional route and orchestrate it to a point of a crescendo. Here you are having the best time at any party in Newport, and you haven't even gotten to the party yet, because you would collect your escort, you would go into the next room to greet the hostess and into another room to meet the guests. But this was the high point right here. Well, White designed this house in New York for parties as well, but he didn't have the luxury of the space or the approach that he had at Rosecliff. This is the house he designed for Payne and Helen Hay Whitney at 979 Fifth Avenue, between 78th and 79th Street. And here, this house was a wedding present to the Payne and his wife. It was from his Payne Whitney's uncle, Oliver Payne, basically gave the couple a blank check, told them to hire Stanford White and build themselves a nice house, which they did. I mean, beginning with the fact that it's solid granite, and which is certainly the fast track towards running up the budget. This house, as you probably know, is now the cultural services of the French Embassy to the United Nations, but it's still open. It's a public building, and the rooms on the ground floor are accessible. I recommend a visit, because in a visit, you will see how White dealt with the fact that he wanted to create this sort of spectacular effect and transition from outside to inside without having the space that he had at Rosecliff. Here he takes an idea that was a typical detail of Italian Renaissance villas. This is the Villa Papa Giulia in Rome. It's near the Borghese Gardens. And this is the loggia, the ground floor, which is open to the outdoors. It's got that wall of columns, and then it has that wonderful vaulted ceiling, which is plaster that is shaped and painted to look like trellis with vines growing in and out of it, and then these allegorical panels. And he does that for the Whitneys, the same sort of ceiling with the panels of trellis, the allegories of love and fertility, in this case, because it was a present for a married couple. But he takes this element, and instead of making that long tunnel-like vault, he makes a shallow dome out of it, which is supported by a ring of columns. This is a space essentially that has no walls. You're in that space, and the only walls are the white marble square walls beyond you. But this is how he creates a transition from inside to outside by creating a sort of a quasi-outdoor space, a space with no walls. And he reinforces the outdoor nature of this with the fountain, which he built out of sort of odds and ends of classical sculpture that he had acquired over the years from various Roman dealers, including that figure of the young boy at the top, which is now generally accepted to be the work of the young Michelangelo. So Stanford White had a good eye indeed. Well, so here was your transitional space. If you were invited to a party at the Whitneys, you would go up those stairs on the left to go to the party rooms on the second floor. But if you were coming to see Mr. or Mrs. Whitney, you would be admitted to a room that's on the other side of those doors on the right. And that room was, I think, Stanford White's single greatest design for an interior. Mrs. Whitney called it the Venetian room. And it is just extraordinary. I mean, waiting in this room to be allowed to go see Mr. and Mrs. Whitney must have been a hallucinatory experience, because this room, we talk about some fine detail that is first revealed by and then dissolved by light. Well, this room is dissolving as you just are sitting there. It has essentially no walls because it's all mirror. Also, it's that estuarial middle ground between architecture and furniture. The elements that are dividing the panes of mirror are based on the frames of neoclassical pier mirrors. And then the cove that runs around the room is this lattice made out of bronze, in this case, with these porcelain roses growing in and out of it, very much like elements from the Rococo Bavarian candlesticks, a design that was based or inspired, I understand, by the clock that Stanford White picked out and set on the mantelpiece there. And this shows that Stanford White could really take ornament and use it to a level of density that approaches saturation, yet at the same time to maintain a coherent design. I mean, it's like leading a 1,000-piece orchestra playing Clair de Lune in a sort of beautifully lucid way. I mean, I don't know any other architect who could both use ornament to this density, maintain the clarity of his designs. And this shows how Stanford White could really step on the gas, but he could also step on the brake as well. This is one of the last projects that he designed. It was actually completed after his death, but it was designed by him. It's the Prison Ship Martyrs Monument in Fort Greene Park in Brooklyn. And here the commission was intended to really recognize and commemorate the memory of thousands, I mean, somewhere between 3,000 and 8,000 colonial prisoners of war who died in prisoner of war ships in the War of the Revolution. It was a really disgraceful episode in the history of warfare. And Stanford White is designing this with almost no ornament except for that one bronze lantern at the top of the column. And he's using essentially the language of silence to tell this unspeakably horrible story. And the language of silence in this case was absolutely correct and is very loud indeed. Well, I'm going to finish up with this picture here. This is a photograph taken at Box Hill, the country house in St. James, taken in June 1905. Here Stanford White is sitting on the blanket. You can see Bessie tugging his ear for some reason. And then sitting with his back to the camera in the white hat is Charles McKim. Sitting in the rocking chair facing the camera is Augustus St. Gaudens. And then to the left in those rocking chairs are Jimmy and Frances Breeze, who were friends of McKim's and White's. They were the clients that White did the house in Southampton for that we saw at the beginning of the lecture. But consider the three protagonists. I mean, McKim, White, and St. Gaudens, that 30 years earlier, I mean, they were just these sort of young redheads heading off to the south of France to take a look at a little architecture and have a little bit of fun. And now they were at the absolute pinnacle of their profession. That St. Gaudens was redesigning the coinage for the United States Mint. I mean, think of the $20 gold piece. St. McKim had just accepted the gold medal from the Royal Institute of British Architects, the first American firm to ever be so honored. And Stanford White was the most visible architect in America at this point. And about a year after this picture was taken, it all comes apart. Stanford White is shot by a madman. St. Gaudens starts to lose his battle to stomach cancer. You can see him ailing slightly in this picture. And by 1909, Charles McKim, with his friends gone, dies, I am convinced, of a broken heart. So if you look forward, there's a slightly melancholic aspect to this, but if you just take this picture at face value, it represents an extraordinary moment in the history of American art, and it has been my pleasure to share it with you. Thank you very much.
Sam, that was absolutely terrific. It was just wonderful, your unique perspective. I will say more at the end, but all I can say is I kept thinking, oh, nothing can top this. And then you'd have another absolutely amazing slide. Wow, it's just incredible what your great grandfather contributed to the architecture of New York City and elsewhere. So thank you. Victoria, do you want to say a few words before I open up the Q&A?
Sam, your great-grandfather was a genius. And I have to say, as a native New Yorker who walks these streets, and you just, when I thought New York could not get any better for me, but even the statue of Farragut, I pass that every day in Madison Square Park. Somebody had addressed that as a question, and I will never look at any of it in the same way. But having said your great-grandfather is a genius, I have to say, what a testament to him you are, because the way you brought his work to life, not only with the images, but the way you described it. So what I have to say to you is this wonderful book with about 243 photographs by Jonathan Wallen, and I want our audience to know this is a treasure house of photos in this book, a feast for the eyes and nourishment for the soul with very little text. So Sam, the pictures are beautiful, but you have to write more because you're spare on words, but we want to read more about you. So
well, Victoria, first of all, thank you. I hope this has been recorded because I need to read paying your compliments. I'll put myself to sleep every night by playing this. Thank you very much for that. My wife Elizabeth and I have written. This is the fourth of the Stanford White books that we've written. So if it's words you want, there are other words. But when I did this book, one of my aunts would be Stanford White's granddaughter. So when she heard that I'd done this book, she said, well, my Lord, what else is there to say? And I said, well, actually, there's nothing left to say. It's all, at this point, you make the argument visually, which is what that book is trying to do. So I was deliberately eager on the words.
Thank you. Thank you. And I will look at those other books as well. So thank you.
Enjoy.
Thank you.
Right, well, now we will start the Q&A. And sorry, just to let you know, if you have your hands up, could you, we're not able to address hands up, so could you type your question? And we are going to try and get to as many questions as possible. We'll take the Q&A for another like 10 or 15 minutes.
I'm not going anywhere, Karen. I'm here.
Okay. This is from Dominique Agostino. He wonders, was there a family influence that steered Stanford White into architecture?
Well, family, yes, in a certain sense, in that Stanford White's father was a journalist and a Shakespeare scholar, actually. He did the first American edition of Shakespeare, but he knew everybody in New York, and he knew John Lafarge, and he sent Stanford White to John Lafarge because White wanted to be a painter, and John Lafarge said, don't be a painter because it's really a hard row to hoe. You'll never make a living as a painter. Try being an architect instead. And so then Stanford White's father, through I think Frederick Law Olmsted, was able to get in touch with Henry Hodgson Richardson and got White a job as the apprentice in Richardson's office. So in that sense, I would say dear old dad did the right thing, but there was never an artistic, I think Stanford White's artistic character came out of nowhere. I mean, I have no sense that there had been any precedent for it.
Thank you. This is from Jeffrey Baldwin. How much experience did Stanford White have of structural engineering, and which of his works needed outside engineering to assist in the creation of the building?
That's a good question, and I'm going to give an incomplete answer. In 1880, well, first of all, when they first started, the engineering was typically done by the contractor. The architect would design this, and then these wonderful contractors in New York would do the engineering. They would do the limited mechanical engineering because there was very limited mechanical systems in it. So White just basically he couldn't do something that was impossible at all. And also that's the nature of I'd say Renaissance architecture, is that it's load bearing. And so visually it looks like it's going to stand up. And so he was not an engineer. There were Mead was an engineer, I think, by proclivity, but it was done in all of these buildings by the contractor.
Right, thank you. The next question is from Deborah Heineman. The amazing compression and release house is where, please? She was momentarily interrupted and missed that vital piece of information.
Oh, what would you like me to say here? I'm not sure what the question was.
Oh, where is the compression and release house? Do you know what that's referring to?
The house. No, I never referred to, well, yes. Oh, that house is in Cornwall, Pennsylvania, which is near Lancaster. And even today in a fast car, it's about a 3.5 or 4 hour trip from New York. You go out in the Pennsylvania Turnpike. It's an interesting house. It was for years and years the clubhouse for the clothing workers union in eastern Pennsylvania, and they jealously protected this house. You could never get to see it, and then they started to make shirts and underwear in Singapore, and the union the clothing workers unions in Pennsylvania were decimated because of this, and the union abandoned that house. They just walked away from it, and then an architect discovered it because basically found this house abandoned and almost about to get into ruinous condition, and bought it and really saved it. So who owns it now, I don't know, because he had to, I think the architect found that he was way over his head financially taking this thing on, but he did save it. And it's in Cornwall, Pennsylvania, and it's called Alden Villa. And you could probably track it down somehow.
Right. Thank you. Alden Villa then, okay. This is from Suzanne Smeaton, who in fact, as many of you may know, was our speaker last week on Frames Could Talk.
Oh, yes.
Oh, and in fact, it's a compliment. Yes.
Suzanne, I was really disappointed that you didn't get into Stanford White because I thought I was going to learn something.
Yeah, well, maybe a future lecture. Anyway, she wanted to say bravo, such a terrific presentation. Thank you. The next question is from Stephen Mormon. Could you please discuss some of White's interior design work for Madison Square Garden?
boy, I wish I could. You know, that the interior of those, principally the opera house, the best room was the opera house. It was a 3,000 seat opera house, I think, and it was considered to be one of the most lovely opera houses in New York. The proscenium was terrific. I've only seen 2 pictures of this, and they weren't very revealing. The main space, the 12,000 seat amphitheater, was basically like the interior of an armory. It wasn't, it was intended to have elements added to it. It didn't have any real interior decoration. And then, so I would say that there's very little recorded of the interior decoration of Madison Square Garden, which is really a shame.
Right, thank you. This next question is from Florence Long. Where is the Farragut station located in New York City? And she also says, fantastic lecture.
Well, thank you very much. Madison Square is intersected by 23rd Street, 26th Street, Madison Avenue, and 5th Avenue, a little corner nipped off by Broadway. And so the statue itself is in the park, right very close to 26th Street, pretty much equidistant from 5th to Madison Avenue, and you can't miss it.
Right, thank you, but that was very helpful. This is just a comment from Billy Ellis, and I have to echo everything she says. Thank you for a spectacular hour. What an eloquent wealth of information you have at your fingertips. So absolutely. This is, and this would be interesting for us all to know. Mary Ezra wonders who offers the best tours of Stanford White architecture in Manhattan, if you know the answer to that question.
The short answer is I don't. I think there are a number of them, and you know, I've never taken one, and so I don't know whose are the best. But every once in a while you will see somebody giving one, and so I could not answer that question. I'm sorry.
And is it something that you have? I know you're very busy with your practice, but is it something that you have ever thought of doing?
No, you know, it's a real skill. The walking tour is. You have to work at it to give a good one, and the people who do it well, I think, generally do it very well. I have not given a walking tour. I've given tours involving travel in buses from place to place around the Hamptons and Long Island, and I signed up for those when I didn't really know what I was getting into. And what I found was that when you're giving one of these tours, that in fact, the single most important thing to know about is where the bathrooms are in the course of the tour, because that's going to become a major, major organizational feature.
Okay, well, there we go. Okay, so you won't be giving any Stanford White
You
tours.
didn't know what you were getting into.
Yes. Again, I'm just going to read out these lovely comments that we received. Agreed, Sam's eloquence was a pleasure. I could listen to his perspective on the architecture of empathy for days on end. And that's from an anonymous attendee.
Oh, thank you, anonymous.
Yes, very nice, very nice. This is from Carl Anderson. Which architects and artists do you think have borrowed the most from Stanford White?
The short answer is I don't think any have, because right after White died, the taste for that sort of saturation of ornament and gold leaf started to evaporate. And that if you think about the interiors done in the late teens and the 20s by architects such as Delano and Aldrich, whereas I think they all admired Stanford White, they really toned it down. It was very, very, the volume was very, very low in terms of the texture and ornament. And then eventually people forgot it. You know, the modern movement took over, and any classical architecture was considered to be anathema. And so White's timing, in a certain sense, was good, in that while he was producing that stuff, it was quite popular. And then right after he died, it was not. I think there are a few architects around who have some of the flair of Stanford White. I mean, take, for example, Peter Marino, a contemporary architect who does sort of extraordinary fabrics and materials. Really just he has a terrific sense of of how you can sort of come up with fabrics and materials that just sort of ramp up the glory of a project. And so I think he's a good example of somebody who has sort of abstracted the lessons of Stanford White, but I don't think there's anybody who could be considered to be a protege or a follower of Stanford White.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. This is from Jeff Jacobson. How much participation or input did Stanford White have in the design of Grand Army Plaza?
I'm assuming you're talking about Grand Army Plaza in Brooklyn, not Grand Army Plaza in New York.
I presume so too. He didn't indicate that, but I'm.
Well, yes. Well, White certainly did the elements that are in the outer circle, the little pavilions and the columns, and he did the entrances around Prospect Park. He did a couple of, I think, the tennis pavilion or the picnic house, I think, was done by him. I've heard that he was involved in the main arch, but I'll just say something really catty right now, which was that the main arch was designed by John Duncan. And Duncan, I think it has got, feet of lead. I think this is a structure that just does not move me at all. And my favorite John Duncan story is that he did the Grant's Tomb, of which Frank Lloyd Wright said that you could not do a single thing to that building without improving it. So anyway, so I'm not a big arch fan, but
right.
White did those elements around the columns, and they're kind of delicious. Those foliate columns that surround the Grand Army Plaza.
Right. Thank you. This is a question from Florence Long. The gentleman's house for J.J. Astor. You mentioned Ferncliff. Is this the house in Westchester near Ferncliff's Cemetery in Ardsley?
No, Astor's house was in Rhinebeck, New York, and it was called Ferncliff. And it was, and so the guest house that Stanford White designed was, as I say, about 500 feet away or 500 yards away from it, rather. And that was called the Ferncliff Casino. So the whole property was called Ferncliff. And the main house was torn down in the 40s. It's kind of a Second Empire horror, and nobody has ever expressed a moment's regret for the loss of the main house. Which, but when the story is that so John Jacob Astor built that in 1902. Astor went down on the Titanic in 1912, and I think it was his 7-year-old son Vincent. At that point, who inherited the Astor fortune and inherited the property, and Vincent actually lived in the Ferncliff Casino, the building with the swimming pool and the tennis court. Lived there with his wife, I think his third wife, Brooke Astor, and then Brooke gave the whole property to Cardinal Spellman when her husband Vincent died, and eventually the house, the tennis court, pavilion, the casino, sort of spun off from the archdiocese into private hands. The archdiocese built a nursing home called the Ferncliff Nursing Home, which is right on River Road in Rhinebeck. Probably the ugliest single building in the Hudson River Valley.
Right. Okay. Sam, would you be willing to take a few more questions?
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
Right. Okay. We'll just take a few more, and perhaps we'll conclude at 7:30 if that's
fine. I'll try to be more politic going forward.
No. Right. This is from Jane Alpert. Was there any relationship between White and Lewis Sullivan?
No.
Right. Okay.
I'm not sure they ever met. I do know that Lewis Sullivan said, after looking at the Chicago Centennial Exposition, which was really the sort of the triumph of the McKim, Mead, and White approach to vocabulary and coherence and design, that Lewis Sullivan said that it set American architecture back 100 years.
Right. Okay. This question is from David Wilder. Where did White live the longest in Manhattan, and did he design his own residence? The
answer to the second part is yes. White lived essentially after he was born in Manhattan, but down in lower Manhattan, where everybody lived in those days, his main house, lived in 3 places, but his main house was on 21st Street and Lexington Avenue, right where the Gramercy Park Hotel is today. And it was an amazing house. He rented it from H.A.C. Taylor, a client of his, and then he just fixed it up to beat the band. It's a wonderful story. And that was his sort of principal place of entertainment in New York at the time that he was at his most celebrated. The earlier houses were sort of starter houses for a young married couple.
Right, thank you. This is a question from Billy Alliance. Do the interiors of the Vouliard house still exist?
Yes, the Vouliard house was actually 6 houses, and of which the southernmost, the southwestern one, the one that's at the corner, I think, of 47th and Madison, was Henry Vouliard's own house. He developed all 6. He sold 5 to his friends, and he kept the biggest for himself. That house was then owned by the Archdiocese. It still actually is owned by the Archdiocese of New York, leased to the hotel. It's an interior landmark so that the principal rooms of that house are intact. It's a place where a number of restaurants have opened and have not succeeded, but it's still a designated interior landmark, and the major rooms will be preserved.
Right, thank you. I think this then will be our last question, and I'm sorry if we didn't get to your comments or questions. This is from Sean Stowe, and he says, Tesla's Wardency Laboratory in Shoreham seems to be a very basic and utilitarian building. Are there other examples of less ornamental functional buildings designed and built by Stanford White?
You bet. Stanford White designed the original buildings for the Niagara Falls Power Station, and you don't get more functional or unornamented than that. So yes, he'd do a barn. He did the Tesla laboratory, which is not a very fancy building out in eastern Long Island. So if you needed a plain barn, I mean, he'd give you a plain barn, but he would design anything. He designed covers for books. He designed frames, jewelry, magazine covers, parades, and even barns.
I mean, he was so immensely talented. So I want to thank you. It was really the most you introduced us, I think many of us, to things about Stanford White that we did not know. I mean, and your infinite and encyclopedic knowledge was, I mean, just extraordinary. And of course, your eloquence, Sam. We are just so grateful for you that one, that you continue to bring attention to your great-grandfather's work, and that you participated in our talk this evening. I imagine that your great-grandfather would be so delighted that his work, I mean, and of course his work is so revered today that things do come round. I'm sure he would be so happy. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. It was really an honor to be part of your series. So thank you for inviting me.
The honor is ours. To have the great grandson of Stanford White is really quite something. Victoria, would you like to say something? And perhaps you'd like to mention the book again. And I have to say, there is a 20%.
What I tell people about the book is that it will make a great house present in the event that any of us is ever invited anywhere again. So, just keep that in mind if you get an invitation. Okay, so, thanks. Signing off.
Just one final word for the evening. Yes, and I mean, Karen, you've said it all. And Sam, we look forward to seeing you again. And something that we do at our in-person presentations is that, well, when someone has presented here, and we have some of our past lecturers on the lecture with us tonight, we never really let anyone go. So we have made you a lifetime member of the General Society Library. So we will get that membership card to you. So we're expecting some in-person visits to our wonderful 200-year-old library.
I look forward to it. I love libraries.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Good night.
All right,
Yes.
thank you.
Yes, so again, thank you so much. I want to thank you, our audience, for again being here and for supporting our talks, which we're very grateful for. I'm just going to very quickly mention a couple of upcoming lectures before I bid you good night. Next Tuesday, on Tuesday, March 30th, we have the Appearance of the Past with Donald Friedman, Principal of Old Structures Engineering. And on Thursday, April 15th, sorry, this is the informal title, but it's the adaptive reuse of a historic structure into St. Anne's Warehouse. And on Tuesday, April 20th, multi-stories, 55 antique skyscrapers and the business tycoons who built them with Mark Hauser. And by the way, it will be architects from Marvel who will be presenting the talk on the conversion of St. Anne's Warehouse. So Sam,
yes, ma'am.
so many thanks to our audience. Thank you again. And now I'm going to
Great questions. Great questions.
Our audience has asked wonderful questions, the really terrific questions. Oh, and I'll just say the recording, we will be editing the beginning, so the recording may take a little longer to get to our audience, but we'll hopefully have that to you by the beginning of next week. So thank you all so very much, and I am now going to end the lecture. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.